There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a homestead when the primary load-bearing pillar of a family is suddenly removed. And it is not a peaceful quiet, but rather the heavy, expectant stillness of a collapsed lung waiting for a breath that will never come. And the wind sweeps across the barren plains, and it rattles the loose tin of the barn roof, and it whistles through the gaps in the floorboards, singing a constant, mocking reminder of all the things that are broken and all the things that are left undone. Sarah knew this silence intimately, for it had been her only companion since the ground thawed enough in early spring to take her husband's pine box, leaving her alone on 100 acres of unforgiving soil with 4 children whose eyes were entirely too large for their faces and whose ribs could be counted when the threadbare cotton of their nightshirts clung to them in the damp evening air. And she was a woman carved from local timber, stubborn and pragmatic. But the sheer arithmetic of her survival was an equation that simply could not be solved by one pair of hands, no matter how callous they became, or how early she rose before the sun to strike the flint and light the stove. The children were quiet, perhaps too quiet for their ages, carrying the grief of their father's passing, not in tears, but in a hollow, wide-eyed observation of their mother's relentless, exhausting motion, watching her chop wood with a dull axe and watching her haul water from a well that was slowly running dry. And the townspeople in the valley below offered their sympathetic nods and their casseroles in the first few weeks, but sympathy is a perishable commodity, and soon they stopped looking her in the eye when she walked into the general store to buy flour on credit, whispering behind their hands that the farm would be foreclosed upon before the first frost, that the widow with 4 orphans was a tragic inevitability, a ship taking on water far too quickly for anyone to bother throwing out a lifeline. She did not ask for help, for pride was the only currency she had left in abundance, and she wore it like a suit of armor, turning away the half-hearted offers of the local men who looked at her land with greedy, calculating eyes and looked at her children as burdensome obstacles, resolving instead to work herself into an early grave if it meant keeping the bank from taking the very dirt her children had learned to walk upon. And so she woke in the dark, and she worked in the dark, and she bled into the soil, planting seeds in the desperate hope that the earth might take pity on a mother's furious devotion. It was a Tuesday in late October when the dust on the horizon coalesced into the shape of a man walking a solitary path up the long, rutted driveway, a man who moved with the slow, deliberate economy of motion that suggested he had walked across many states and found most of them wanting, carrying a canvas rucksack over one shoulder and wearing a coat that had been mended so many times it was more scar tissue than fabric. And the farm dog did not bark when he approached, merely lifting its heavy head and thumping its tail once against the porch boards, as if recognizing a kindred, weary spirit. Sarah stepped out onto the veranda, wiping her flour-dusted hands on a stained apron, her jaw set into a hard, defensive line, holding a broom handle less like a cleaning implement and more like a javelin, while her 4 children clustered behind the screen door, peering out like small, frightened mice in the presence of a stray wolf. But the man did not look like a wolf. He looked like a piece of the landscape that had suddenly decided to stand up and walk, with a face weathered into deep canyons by the sun and eyes the color of old, oxidized copper. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, taking off a battered felt hat and holding it loosely against his thigh, looking at the rotting porch railings, the sagging roof of the barn, the overgrown weeds choking the garden, and finally, he looked at her, holding her gaze with a quiet, unblinking respect that made her grip the broom handle even tighter to stop her hands from trembling under the sudden weight of being truly seen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sounded like stones grinding together at the bottom of a deep river. "I saw the notice down at the feed store in town saying you were looking for a hired hand, and I have 2 good arms and a back that hasn't given out on me yet." Sarah let out a short, harsh breath that was entirely devoid of humor, shaking her head as she looked at this drifter who had walked into the middle of her slow-motion tragedy, feeling the defensive anger flare up in her chest because she knew what the men in town said about her, and she knew exactly how impossible her situation was, and she refused to let a stranger pity her. "That notice has been up for 6 months, mister," she said, her voice sharp and brittle as breaking glass, And nobody in town took the job because they know I can't pay a fair wage, and they know the work is enough to kill a mule. But more than that, I am not just a widow with a failing farm." She gestured sharply toward the screen door, where 4 pairs of anxious eyes blinked in the shadows, her chin rising in an act of fierce, desperate defiance as she laid her cards on the table, expecting him to turn around and walk away just like everyone else had. "I come with 4 orphans," the widow warned. The words hanging in the crisp autumn air like a challenge, daring him to flinch, daring him to realize the absolute impossibility of taking on another man's ruin and another man's children. The drifter did not blink, and he did not look away, and he did not cast a pitiful glance toward the children in the doorway. He simply put his hat back on his head, adjusting the brim to block the mid-morning sun, and he looked at the rotting wood of the porch, and then he looked back at her with a profound, terrifying calm. "I've got broad shoulders," the drifter said, and he walked past her, picked up the dull axe resting by the woodpile, and began to chop. The first week was defined by a profound, rhythmic silence that echoed across the homestead, characterized not by the absence of sound but by the absence of idle chatter, as Elias. For that was the name he had given, just Elias, nothing more. Moved through the property like a force of nature, systematically dismantling the decay that had threatened to swallow the farm whole, and he did not ask for a bedroom inside the house, choosing instead to clear out a small corner of the hayloft where he laid out a bedroll in a single wool blanket, rising hours before the dawn to begin the brutal labor of mending the perimeter fences before the livestock could wander any further into the neighboring gullies. Sarah watched him from the kitchen window as she kneaded the morning dough, her hands working the flour rhythmically while her mind wrestled with a deep, ingrained suspicion, waiting for the inevitable moment when he would complain, or demand more food, or simply pack up his meager belongings and disappear into the night once he realized the sheer, unyielding magnitude of the work required to keep them all alive. But the days bled into one another, and the pile of chopped firewood beside the back door grew from a meager mound into a massive, imposing wall of seasoned oak, and the hinges on the barn doors stopped squealing, and the roof stopped leaking over the children's beds. The children, for their part, treated him like a large, unpredictable animal that had wandered into their territory, keeping a safe distance and communicating in hushed whispers whenever he was near. But Elias never forced their boundaries, never demanded their affection, and never attempted to step into the vast, hollow shoes left by their father, instead communicating his presence through practical, undeniable acts of service. He would leave a perfectly carved wooden whistle on the porch railing for the youngest boy to find, or he would silently take the heavy slop buckets from Alara's struggling hands without breaking his stride, offering no smile and expecting no gratitude, operating under a code of quiet competence that slowly, imperceptibly began to weave a safety net beneath the fractured family. And Sarah found herself setting an extra plate at the dinner table on the porch, serving him thick slices of ham and generous scoops of potatoes, which he ate with the focused intensity of a man who had known true starvation, always finishing his meal by quietly thanking her, tipping his hat, and returning to the barn as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. The turning of the season brought the bitter chill of November, and with it came the first true clash of their profound, unyielding stubbornness, a quiet battle of wills waged not with shouting or hostility, but with the intensely frustrating politeness of two people who were entirely too used to carrying the world by themselves and absolutely refused to let the other take the heavier end of the yoke. It started over the winter wheat, specifically the eastern field where the soil was notoriously rocky and prone to freezing early, a plot of land Sarah insisted on turning over by hand because her husband had always done it that way, and she was out there in the biting wind, her hands wrapped in thin wool gloves, struggling to drive the plow blade into the hardened earth when Elias quietly appeared. Beside her, gently but firmly wrapping his massive, calloused hands over hers on the wooden handles and waiting in absolute silence for her to let go. "I have managed this field for 12 years, Elias," she said, her voice tight with exhaustion and pride, her breath pluming in the freezing air as she refused to release her grip, staring straight ahead at the barren dirt rather than looking at him, because looking at him meant acknowledging how badly her back ached and how numb her fingers were. "The soil is too cold, Sarah," he replied softly, his voice carrying that infuriating, even cadence that never wavered. And he did not pull the plow away from her by force, but rather stood there, immovable as a mountain, his presence a physical barrier to her self-destruction. "If you turn it now, you'll break the blade, and we don't have the coin for a new one before spring." They stood there in the freezing wind for what felt like an eternity. Two fiercely independent souls locked in a silent negotiation of trust, the tension stretching tight as a wire between them, until Sarah finally let out a frustrated, shuddering sigh and released the handles, stepping back and crossing her arms defensively. "Fine," she snapped, turning sharply on her heel. "But if the frost kills the roots before the snow insulates them, we will be eating nothing but potatoes until June, and you will be the one explaining it to the children." Elias watched her storm back toward the house, his expression unreadable, and then he quietly unhitched the mule, led it back to the barn, and spent the entire night hauling buckets of warm ash from the town mill, spreading it over the eastern field by moonlight to alter the soil's temperature just enough to protect the seeds. And when Sarah woke the next morning and saw the black, insulated earth stretching across the acreage, she stood on the porch for a very long time, her pride warring with a deep, unfamiliar swelling of profound relief, realizing that for the first time in a year, an argument did not mean she was entirely alone in the aftermath. Before we see how the deep snows of winter shaped this fragile, stubborn little family, I'd love to know where you are listening from today. There is something incredibly beautiful about knowing that a story of an isolated farmhouse is echoing across cities and countries around the world. So please, drop your location in the comments below. It truly is a privilege to read them. The winter that arrived in late December was not merely cold. It was a violent, screaming entity that sought to bury the valley in a suffocating blanket of white, trapping the family inside the small farmhouse for weeks on end as the snowdrifts piled higher than the first-floor windows, turning the homestead into a claustrophobic wooden submarine navigating a frozen, hostile ocean. Elias had moved inside when the temperatures dropped below freezing, sleeping on a braided rug by the cast-iron stove, and the forced proximity brought a new, crackling tension to the air, an intimate awareness of each other's rhythms and habits as they navigated the small space, the smell of wood smoke and damp wool hanging heavy in the air. It was during the worst night of the blizzard, when the wind was howling like a wounded animal and the beams of the house were groaning under the weight of the snow, that the oldest boy, Thomas, a boy who had been forced to become a man far too early and carried a deep, unresolved anger about it, finally challenged the quiet drifter who had taken up residence in his father's house. The fire had burned low, and Elias was quietly stoking the embers when Thomas, unable to sleep and pacing the floorboards like a caged feral cat, suddenly kicked a heavy log across the room, his small hands balled into fists, his face red with a complex, terrifying mixture of grief, fear, and a desperate need to find a target for his pain. "You're not my father!" the boy shouted over the roar of the storm outside, his voice cracking with the desperate strain of an 11-year-old trying to sound authoritative, tears streaming down his dirty cheeks as he glared at Elias. "You don't belong here. You're just some tramp who's going to leave when the money runs out, just like everyone else." Sarah, who had been dozing in the rocking chair, jolted awake, her heart dropping into her stomach as she prepared to intervene, terrified that the boy's outburst would be the final straw that broke the drifter's patience. But Elias simply placed the iron poker back on its hook, brushing the ash from his hands, and slowly knelt down so he was eye level with the furious, trembling boy. "I am not your father, Thomas," Elias said, his voice dropping below the register of the howling wind, carrying a heavy, resonant truth that vibrated in the small room. And he did not reach out to touch the boy, offering him the dignity of his personal space. "Your father built this house, and he gave you his name, and no man can ever take that from him, or from you. But the roof is holding tonight, and the fire is warm, and as long as I have breath in my lungs, the storm stays outside." He held the boy's tear-filled gaze with an unwavering, unshakable certainty, a promise carved into stone, and slowly, The fight drained out of Thomas, his small shoulders collapsing as he sank to the floor, weeping violently into his hands. And Elias did not try to comfort him with empty platitudes. He simply sat beside him on the braided rug, a silent, immovable anchor in the storm, and Sarah watched them from the shadows, her hand pressed tight against her mouth to stifle her own tears, realizing that the drifter had not just reinforced the beams of the house, he was slowly reinforcing the shattered beams of her children's hearts. When the spring thaw finally broke the spine of the winter, the valley woke up to a world rendered in blinding mud and desperate, chaotic growth. And with the melting snow came the return of the outside world, specifically the town banker, a man named Mr. Abernathy, who arrived in a polished black buggy with a leather ledger tucked under his arm, expecting to find the widow destitute, starving, and ready to sign over the deed to the property for pennies on the dollar. He stepped carefully through the mud, adjusting his spectacles as he took in the repaired roof, the straightened fence lines, and the smoke pluming steadily from the chimney. His expression souring as Sarah walked out onto the porch, her chin held high, no longer the terrified, hollow-eyed woman of the previous autumn, but a woman grounded by a brutal, victorious survival. "Mrs. Miller," Abernathy said, his voice dripping with condescension as he opened his ledger, standing at the bottom of the steps. "I am surprised to see you still in residence. I assume you are aware that the balloon payment on your late husband's loan is due by the end of the month, and I am not here to offer extensions to charity cases." Sarah opened her mouth to reply, but the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on timber announced Elias's arrival from the barn, and he did not step in front of Sarah to shield her, nor did he puff out his chest in a display of performative dominance. He simply walked up onto the porch and stood shoulder to shoulder with her, his massive presence throwing a long, intimidating shadow over the banker's buggy, crossing his thick arms and waiting. "The payment will be made in full on Friday, Abernathy," Sarah said, her voice ringing clear and strong in the crisp spring air, empowered by the silent monolith of a man standing beside her. And they both knew the winter wheat had survived, and the timber Elias had cut and sold to the railroad camp over the winter had yielded more than enough coin to satisfy the debt. The banker looked at the fierce, unbroken widow, and then he looked at the drifter, whose cold, copper eyes promised a swift and violent end to any man who tried to cheat the woman standing beside him. And Abernathy swallowed hard, snapping his ledger shut and retreating to his buggy without another word, the wheels spinning in the mud as he drove away in a panicked rush. And as the buggy disappeared down the road, Elias did not smile, and he did not boast. He simply tipped his hat to Sarah, picked up a bucket, and went back to work. But the way her eyes followed him across the yard spoke volumes of a quiet, seismic shift in the tectonic plates of their shared existence. The years that followed did not announce their passing with grand, theatrical events, but rather slipped by in the steady, rhythmic turning of the seasons, measured in the notches carved into the kitchen doorframe as the children shot up like weeds, measured in the expansion of the eastern fields, and measured in the slow, beautiful graying of Elias's hair at the temples, a quiet testament to a decade of unrelenting, dedicated labor. He never formally proposed, and there was no grand wedding beneath an arch of roses. The transition from hired hand to patriarch was an unspoken, organic evolution, realized one cold November evening when Sarah, watching him mend a bridle by the fire, simply walked over, took the leather from his calloused hands, and pulled him gently by the wrist into the bedroom they had awkwardly avoided sharing for years, locking the door behind them and finally laying down the heavy armor of her independence to let herself be held by the broad shoulders that had carried her world. The children grew into fiercely capable adults, shaped by the contrasting forces of their mother's pragmatic fire and their stepfather's immovable, quiet strength. Thomas became the town's most respected carpenter, building houses with the same methodical care Elias had used to rebuild his fractured childhood. Alara moved to the city to teach, carrying the stubborn dignity of a woman raised on hard earth, and the twins took over the daily operations of the farm, their laughter echoing across the fields that had once been steeped in such profound, suffocating sorrow. Elias remained a man of devastatingly few words, but his love was a physical, tangible thing, woven into the very fabric of the homestead. It was the extra blanket he pulled over Sarah's shoulders when she fell asleep, reading in the parlor. It was the perfectly carved wooden rocking chair he built for their first grandchild. And it was the way he always, without fail, ensured her coffee cup was full before he poured his own, a daily liturgy of devotion that required no poetic declarations, for true endurance does not need a megaphone to announce its presence. The house eventually emptied, as all houses must when they have done their job correctly and raised children strong enough to leave, and the sudden quiet that returned to the homestead was no longer the terrifying, breathless silence of grief that Sarah had known all those years ago, but rather a deep, resonant peace, the satisfied exhalation of a long, difficult job done exceptionally well. They were older now, their steps slower and their joints aching with the memory of 1,000 cold mornings and 1,000,000 heavy burdens lifted, and they spent their evenings sitting on the veranda, the same veranda where a desperate widow had once stood with a broom handle and warned a dusty stranger about 4 orphans, watching the sun dip below the horizon and paint the valley in brilliant shades of fire and gold. Sarah would sit in her rocking chair, a patchwork quilt draped over her knees, and she would look at the man sitting beside her, tracing the deep lines of his face with her eyes, marveling at the sheer, miraculous improbability of their shared life, recognizing that the universe had not sent her a savior on a white horse, but had instead provided a man with dirt on his boots and an iron spine, a man who understood that love was not a feeling to be chased, but a structure to be built, board by board, nail by nail, through the worst storms the world could muster. They rarely spoke of those early, desperate days, because the evidence of their victory was all around them, in the sprawling, fertile acres of wheat, in the letters from their children stacked neatly on the mantelpiece, and in the quiet, absolute certainty that they would face the twilight of their lives exactly as they had faced the dawn of their struggle, together, stubborn, and entirely unbroken. Decades later, when the town of Oak Haven speaks of the Miller farm, they do not speak of the tragedy that nearly broke it, but of the quiet drifter who walked out of the dust and the fierce widow who refused to let the earth swallow her whole, proving that the most profound romances are not written in passionate letters or shouted from balconies, but are carved out of the hard dirt of daily survival, built on a foundation of mutual respect, unspoken promises, and the willingness to stand in the freezing wind until the work is done. It is a reminder that we are rarely equipped to carry the full weight of the world on our own, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not fighting the battle alone, but having the bravery to look at a stranger standing on your broken porch and deciding to trust that their shoulders are broad enough to share the load. Take care of your own. Appreciate the quiet acts of love that surround you, and remember that the heaviest burdens are the ones we stubbornly refuse to share. May you find the strength to weather your own storms, and may you find the right hands to help you hold the roof up when the wind begins to howl. Until next time.